My name is Berit Ebert. I'm the Vice President of Programs here at the American Academy in Berlin, and I welcome you all to the Nina Maria Gorrison lecture entitled Tyrants, Invaders, Sinners. Order in the Visigothic Kingdom, 507 to 711 CE by Damián Fernández, who is Associate Professor of History at Northern Illinois University and this semester's Nina Maria Gorrison Fellow. The fellowship was inaugurated in 2011 and is possible thanks to the generous support of Nina von Malzahn, to whom we are extremely grateful as she funds one of the cornerstone activities, the fellowship program here at the American Academy. And she has enabled, in doing so, bringing over Damián, which is, of course, the most important factor of all of that. And here at the Academy, Damián has been working on a project in which he undertakes a reassessment of how historians and modern political theorists have approached the question of government during the transitions from antiquity to the Middle Ages. The dominant narrative in that regard presumes the Christianization of political discourse and ideas of rulership. And Damián would not be Damián would he not challenge that. He studies the Visigothic kingdom's political culture by looking at nothing less than rebels and rebellion. Knowing that half of the king's access to throne through coups and rebellions, Damián asks, what is a legitimate kingdom, a kingship, a kingdom? How was power thought about? What is it? What was it? And in asking these questions, Damián challenges the paradigm of straightforward Christianization, arguing that it was only one among several traditions that were deployed to define and to enact political authority. As you can all imagine, such research does not go unnoticed. Dear Damián, I'm very happy, and it's my pleasure to congratulate you on receiving a Humboldt Fellowship for the next year. In Berlin, which, as many of you know, is an important center for the study of late antiquity, Damián has been exchanging ideas with local colleagues about ancient roots of order-granting political authority in modern political thought. And I just learned that all the friends of the Visigothic time are actually here tonight. So it's this is one friend, and probably the friend and expert, will be introducing Damián tonight. You all know about the Academy's obsession with introductions. And Damián will be introduced by Professor Stefan Estes, and it is now my pleasure to briefly introduce Stefan. Stefan is Professor of Late Antique and Early Medieval History at the Freie Universität in Berlin. He has received his PhD in ancient history at the University of Freiburg and defended his habilitation thesis at the University of Bochum, where he had taught from 1995 to 2006. What came next in my introduction is a paragraph about all his research interests. And the fact that he is really the most prominent figure in the field is underlined by his humbleness. He came to me before and said, no, it's too long, just make it a sentence. So we agreed that he can be summarized under the term, or his research can be summarized by saying, or I can state that he focuses on barbarian kingdoms of the post-Roman West. And since, well, we will know more about your thoughts later. He is the author of 7 monographs and countless academic articles, and between 2004 and 2017, he gave nearly 150 public talks, and the list of his scholarly output is constantly growing. Visit his website and read. Among his most academic honors is a fellowship at the Humanities Council and the program in medieval studies at Princeton University, where he was also previously a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies. But most importantly for us, he is a good friend of the American Academy. He is an invaluable resource for our fellows. And this is not the first time that he is here and has been here. He has introduced before, and we certainly hope that it will not be the last time that you're doing that. So please come back. The structure of the evening tonight. We will hear now Professor Esther's introduction, then Damián will give his lecture. We will then hear a response by Professor Esther's and then a conversation between the two. You are warmly invited to ask questions, both in the room and in Zoom. For our Zoom audience, please use the Q&A function. Without further ado, I now turn the floor to Professor Stefan Esters, and I look forward to a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Okay, I would first like to thank the Vice President of Programs of the American Academy for this very kind introduction, but it's still too much. It is always a very special thing to be here at the American Academy, and it means a lot to our field of study that from time to time renowned scholars from the US have the opportunity here to stay in Berlin for a longer period, and thereby making this city, this place, not only a visible place of intellectual and scholarly exchange in their particular field, but also to make it visible and renew the many ties between the Berlin universities, notably the Freie Universität, and numerous American institutions and universities. And the American Academy makes an extraordinarily important contribution to this, and to be part of events like the one tonight is certainly one of the greatest privileges for me as being based here at Berlin. Dear fellows and friends of the American Academy, dear guests, welcome to this year's Nina Maria Gorrison lecture, also from my side. It is a very great pleasure and honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker to you, Professor Damián Fernández from Northern Illinois University. He's going to lead us into what seems at first sight to be an extremely specialized field of medieval studies, that is the history of the Visigothic kingdom in early medieval Spain. But I can assure you, first, that on closer inspection, several topics of these 200 years of history of the distant past are astonishingly relevant to understand how modern political and legal institutions evolved. And secondly, that we could not imagine a person more suited and qualified to make us familiar with this period of history and with its ongoing relevance for today. Damián Fernández was born and raised in Argentina, and after school first attended the Universidad de Buenos Aires to do his BA or licenciado in history. From there, he started to what we now see in hindsight as an impressively international and courageous career. From Argentina, Damián first went to Canada to complete an MA in Religious Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. That was in 2003. And from there he moved to Princeton University, where he obtained his PhD in history in 2010. In the same year, he became first assistant and later associate professor at the Department of History at Northern Illinois University, where he is based since then, although he has also taught at Cornell University and at the University of Buenos Aires for some time. It is from DeKalb and Ithaca that he could come to the American Academy as a Nina Maria Gorrison Fellow, and we are happy and proud, as we just heard, that he also won the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, which will allow him and his family to stay for another year in Berlin, which is simply great for him, but also for us. South and North America, the US, and finally Berlin, Wannsee. This is, by the way, also matches quite nicely with the life of the person who is sponsoring this fellowship at the American Academy and whose generosity has enabled us to be here tonight. Before we hear Damián speaking, I would like to say a few words on his work and on his approach to history. As I said, he did an MA in Religious Studies, and at Princeton he wrote and completed his thesis under the supervision of Peter Brown, who can certainly be named as the one person who did most to establish late antiquity as a field of research and study in many universities on both sides of the Atlantic, and whose approach to religious history and the history of Christianity in particular has really shaped the way to approach the transition between the two epochs of antiquity and the Middle Ages in a more general sense. In fact, Damián and I first met at a conference on occasion of the retirement of Peter Brown in Princeton back in spring 2011, and I was deeply impressed then to listen to so many papers by former students of Peter Brown who covered topics geographically spread from Armenia and Georgia over Egypt, Italy, Gaul to Ireland and Spain. For Damián, late Roman Spain became the field he felt most immediately attracted to. His dissertation, Aristocrats and Statehood in Western Iberia, 300 to 600 CE, published with University of Pennsylvania Press in 2017, traces the history of Spain from the late Roman provinces of Iberia into the Visigothic period, with a focus on statehood and social history, using the written evidence, but also making use of a large amount of archaeological material. His main idea here was to analyze how an imperial aristocracy, the late Roman aristocracy, transformed into a more regionally oriented elite that was very active in creating a polity that would have the Iberian Peninsula as its center, and that would become an important reference point in the history of Spain. In the course of time, numerous articles and collaborative projects, Damián focused his work more and more on the history of the Visigothic period, which fascinated him and became a second field of interest. He is currently working with others on a translation and commentary of the Liber Judiciorum, a huge law code issued in the 7th century, which is among the most important sources for this period. While this also points to his interest in a fundamental text of Western legal and, should I say, constitutional history, he developed this into a wider perspective by co-organizing recently an international conference on the Liber Judiciorum at Yale Law School, and which I think showed the importance of this topic. And it included experts from South America, from Spain, from Europe, and the US in an international undertaking. And in his work on Visigothic Spain, Damián is also in close cooperation with colleagues from Spain, from various countries of South America, including his alma mater, and thus in a way embodies why this field can also build a bridge between globally different historiographies and academic cultures. But Visigothic Spain is also of considerable general interest, as many features of the Western legal and constitutional history actually have their origin there, such as the unction of kings, the conceptualization of kingship as office, the division between crown property and dynastic property, and many more things. We will now be made more familiar with some of these achievements, or at least with some of the events that may have caused them in the long term, in Damián's talk on Tyrants, Invaders, and Sinners, the quest for order in the Visigothic kingdom, 507 to 711 CE. So, Damián, we are very much looking forward to listening to your paper. The Wannsee floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for these kind words, which make Visigothic history interesting. And thank you also, Berit, for the introduction. It is a pleasure and an honor to deliver this semester's Nina Maria Gorison's lecture in history. I would like to start by thanking the American Academy in Berlin and the donor for this unique opportunity to work on my project. I would also like to thank the American Academy staff for the amazing work they do in running the institution and supporting the fellows' projects. I cannot think of better conditions under which to conduct research than those made possible by everybody at the Academy. My most sincere thanks also to Professor Stefan Esters, who agreed to participate in this event. As Berit just described, he's one of the most prominent legal historians of the early Middle Ages, and I'm humbled for his willingness to converse on my project. Finally, I'd like to thank the other fellows and their partners. I have learned immensely from all of you, and I feel privileged to have participated in so many stimulating conversations during my time at the Academy. So, today I would like to take you to the centuries between the demise of the Roman Empire in Western Europe and the Arab conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, roughly between the 5th and the 8th centuries CE. Outside of specialized circles, this period is often known as the fall of Rome, or even sometimes the Dark Ages. For reasons too long to explain here, we historians avoid such concepts and prefer the less gloomy late antiquity or early Middle Ages. At the American Academy, I'm working on a project on rebellion and political culture in late antiquity, as both Berit and Stefan mentioned. And I focus on one of the so-called successor kingdoms of the Roman Empire, the kingdom of the Visigoths. I'm aware that many of you are not too familiar with the history of the Visigoths, so I'm going to give you a sort of Wikipedia introduction to it. The Visigoths were a confederacy of different ethnic groups that coalesced around the leadership of a Gothic warlord elite by the 4th century in the lower Danube region. They fought against, but also frequently for the Romans. For reasons too long to explain now, some of these groups ended up within the borders of the Roman Empire, and one Gothic warlord, Alaric, led the famous sack of Rome of 410. After a peace treaty with the Romans, they settled in Aquitaine, in today's southwestern France, in 418. Eventually, they carved a polity within the cracks of the crumbled empire and ruled over the Roman population of large parts of modern France and the Iberian Peninsula, or Hispania, as it was known at the time. Defeated by the Franks in 507, Visigothic elites built a kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula and a small strip of southern Gaul, which would last until the Arab conquest in 711. My starting point to study the Visigothic kingdom's political culture is very specific, namely attempts, successful or not, to overthrow and replace Visigothic kings. In other words, I'm entering the study of political culture from the back door, from the study of those who were deemed a main threat to the orderly succession of kings. For lack of a better term, I will call these episodes dynastic rebellions or political rebellions. These terms are certainly not ideal, for reasons we can discuss later, but I prefer them to usurpation, which implies accepting certain claims of legitimacy, which I strive to avoid in studying these types of rebellion. Contemporaries perceived dynastic rebellion as a central, if not the central, political problem of the kingdom. A noted bishop and church historian from the neighboring Frankish kingdom, Gregory of Tours, claimed that the Goths had adopted the abominable practice of killing kings they did not like. The Christian intellectual and bishop Isidore of Seville described the Visigothic past as a period of mutual devastation between Goths. The Burgundian chronicler Fredegar referred to Visigothic political violence as, quote, the disease of the Goths. And towards the end of the Visigothic kingdom, a council of bishops declared that, quote, the savage custom of plotting against rulers became widespread, so that either the king is killed through various means or he is deprived of royal dignity, unquote. These harsh assessments were rooted in historical reality. Almost half of the Visigothic kings acceded to the throne after a rebellion, a palace coup, or the assassination of their predecessors. And this count doesn't include failed attempts at overthrowing kings. The judgments of the contemporaries I quoted corresponded to the anxieties of the kingdom's elites. Rebellion and coups could lead to violent civil wars, exiles, and purges. Accessions triggered land and office redistribution that rewarded loyalty to the victor and punished opposition. The perception that political rebellion was a serious threat may explain why there is so much evidence about failed and successful coups, despite the relative dearth of documents to study other aspects of Visigothic history. Visigothic laws, church councils, chronicles, histories, letters, and even hagiographies, that is, lives of Christian saints and ascetics, provide bountiful evidence about rebellions. Even material culture, such as coinage, offers images of rebel contenders who issued their own currency. In the limited time I have today, I'd like to share some thoughts about how the kingdom's elite instrumentalized Visigothic rebellion in the service of political domination. Due to the weight of rebellion in Visigothic political life and the anxieties it created among ruling elites, Visigothic political and legal discourse construed rebellion as one of the most, if not the most, dangerous crimes, as in many other ancient and even modern polities. Seeking to overthrow a king represented more than attacking the person of the king. It threatened the very existence of a God-granted power to rule. Repressing the rebel implied the restoration of political, territorial, and cosmic order. Visigothic thinkers and political elites realized the tremendous power behind the notion of royal command to curb rebels. Because determining where rebellion ended and legitimate dissidence began was always a political decision, rebelhood could be and was expanded to new areas of political life. In this presentation, I will focus on three, as it were, ideal types of rebels, namely the tyrant, the invader, and the sinner. Through three examples, I will showcase how political discourse expanded the boundaries of rebellion within the context of power redefinition in a post-Roman society. My presentation will be structured around three vignettes, three snapshots taken at different moments in the history of the Visigothic kingdom. The goal is not to provide you with a complete history of Visigothic rebellion, but to offer you a flavor of these projects' types of primary sources with their problems and possibilities. Let me start with the first snapshot. This is a chronicle written by a Christian author known as John of Viclarum. John was a Goth who was born in what is today Portugal. He had a relatively long and eventful career. He spent his formative years in the capital of the Empire of the Romans, Constantinople. Upon his return to Hispania in the 580s, he was imprisoned, perhaps under suspicion of being a Byzantine agent. After his release, he founded a monastery in eastern Spain, and no later than 592, he became Bishop of Girona in Catalonia. By the turn of the 7th century, he had written a chronicle of the main event in Hispania, the Byzantine Empire, and other Mediterranean kingdoms during the second half of the 6th century. John's chronicle provides the first extant, coherent historical narrative about what we could call today state formation in post-imperial Iberia. Writing from the early 7th century, the Bishop of Girona looked back at the preceding decades and celebrated the Gothic monarchy as the culmination of a triple process. The triumph of Christian orthodoxy with the conversion of the Goths to Nicene Christianity, the Goths were Arian Christians before that. The defeat, with God's help, of external enemies, and above all, the crushing of political rebels. His understanding of political rebellion is the first step in my book. In the last entry of the chronicle devoted to the year 591, during the reign of the Gothic king Reccared, John notes, "While Reccared ruled in orthodox quiet peace, domestic conspiracies spread. For a member of his own private household, indeed a duke called Archmund, wanted to seize power illegitimately from King Reccared and, if successful, deprive him of his kingdom and his life. But the machination of the wicked council were detected. Archmund was first interrogated while being whipped, and his head was shaved in disgrace, and his right hand was cut off. He was paraded sitting on an ass through the city of Toledo as an example to all, teaching servants not to be presumptuous to their lords." Two ideas from this passage are worth noting. First, Late Roman language dominates this text. In John's eyes, argument would have become a tyrant or tyrannus, a term that late Roman authors used to describe illegitimate rulers. The tyrannus was an emperor who acceded to the throne through usurpation, and not necessarily an over-despotic ruler. In late antiquity, the concept tyrannus was extended to include other meanings, such as a ruler who persecuted Christians or a morally flawed king. However, John's use of tyrannus is rooted in the late Roman concept of the ruler usurper. Moreover, John draws a parallel between the relationship of the king and argument and the relationship between a lord and a servant, dominus and famulus. These terms, as John knew, were polysemic. They could also signify master and slave, indicating this quasi-proprietary relationship between king and his subject. As Isabel Velázquez argued, the chronicle deploys the language of property law to describe political and military interventions. This choice of lexicon indicated, among other things, the concept of rule by right of conquest, the idea of uncontested royal dominion over people and land. This is important because it also explains John's extension of the category of tyrants to situations beyond dynastic rebellion. The readers of John's chronicle would have arrived at the tale of Argument's rebellion after a long narrative of military campaigns during the reign of Recared's father, Leovigild. Leovigild intervened against cities and territories that sought to preserve some degree of autonomy and probably resisted Gothic centralizing reforms after the mid-6th century. But in John's mind, the reign of Leovigild was a moment of restoration, the taking back of a lost territory and a new foundational moment of the Gothic kingdom. As he put it, Leovigild wonderfully restored to its former boundaries the province of the Goths, which by that time had been diminished by the rebellion of various persons. Who were these rebels? John expresses it in fierce language. With tyrants destroyed on all sides and the invaders of Hispania overcome, King Leovigild had peace to reside with his own people. John expands the epithet of tyrant from dynastic rebels, individuals who wanted to seize the throne for themselves, to cities, communities, and even what he in a couple of occasions calls rustics, perhaps a reference to rebelling peasant groups. Tyrants, in John's view, had dominated the Gothic past and had torn apart the territory that belonged to the Goths. There is no indication that these groups sought to impose a new ruler or gain full independence. John of Viclarum thus flattened the diversity of groups and communities who resisted the centralizing program of the king and presented their behavior as political usurpation. In the closing lines of the chronicle, John provides his readers with the key to understanding the past. Resisting communities were tyrants, servant communities that the master king had to teach not to be presumptuous. In brief, John's chronicle offers a historical narrative of Gothic statehood as a process of crushing rebellion in order to blend the social, territorial, and political orders. My next example draws from legal sources. While John of Viclarum expanded the idea of dynastic rebellion to different forms of political dissidence, legislation situated the figure of the rebel within a continuum of actions that blurred the boundaries between internal and external war, between the rebel and the invader. This was possible thanks to the development of a focus of loyalty distinct, though not completely dissociated, from the figure of the king. By the mid-7th century, King Chindasvins, himself a former rebel contender, issued the most explicit Visigothic law yet against dynastic rebels. The law prescribed harsh punishment for political rebels, including capital sentence, though the king could commute it to eye gouging and possibly enslaving. Rebels were also deprived of their property, but unlike most confiscations under Visigothic law, their property will not be forcibly transmitted to their own heirs. Rather, the law granted the king the power to give it to whomever he wished, with the full transference of ownership rights. Political rebellion also allowed judges to trigger special procedural measures such as judicial torture and discretionary power of royal pardon. And those of you who are familiar with late Roman legislation will identify some common elements here. Under Smith's law, however, charges could be brought against, unquote, whoever has journeyed or will journey to an enemy people or a foreign land, or has even wished to, or at some point might wish to, go there in order to act with most wicked rashness against the nation, people, against, or the fatherland, patria, of the Goths, or wishes to cause an uprising or conspiracy within the territory of the fatherland of the Goths, to the disadvantage of our kingdom and nation people, or are or were reported to be attempting or to have attempted our assassination or deposition or that of our successor kings. If John of Biclarum rebuked the failed tyrant argument for trying to seize the kingdom and the king's life, Smith characterized rebellion with greater inflationary zeal. Attempts at overthrowing the king are situated in a liminal position between foreign war and civil war. This law's historical context is relevant. Smith had in mind the Gothic aristocrats exiled to the Frankish kingdoms after his violent accession in 642. Yet this was nothing new. Visigothic political rebels often relied on external support to challenge the sitting kings. Franks, Byzantines, and Suevi, among others, occasionally backed alternative contenders to the Visigothic throne with armies or monies. The connection between rebel and invader also resulted from the intellectual reformulation of the Visigothic polity. By the 7th century, the political elites in the Visigothic kingdom seemed to have agreed on a definition of the polity that transcended the idea of a conquered land. This definition is perhaps one of the most original features of Visigothic political thought. What was this definition? About a decade before the rebellion accession of Smith, a council of bishops and magnates met to legitimize the accession of another rebel usurper, Sisenand, and condemned a recent rebellion against the now legitimate king. The council issued an invective against political rebels and established a procedure to elect future kings, a procedure that was rarely, if ever, followed. More relevant for the present discussion, this council, known as the Fourth Council of Toledo, defined political rebellion as perjury or perfidia, since it was a crime committed by, and I quote here, anyone who violates by conspiracy or intrigue the oath sworn for the tranquility of the fatherland and the nation people of the Gauls, and for the preservation of the life of the ruler, and who attempts to the violent death of the ruler, or to diminish the power of the kingdom, or illegally seize the throne with tyrannical intention. The wording of this canon resembles the future law of Smith. Like the treason law a decade later, the canon reminded the kingdom's inhabitants that they owed their loyalty not just to the king, but to a political entity defined in territorial, historical, and affective terms, the fatherland and the nation people of the Goths. The entity fatherland and nation people provided a nexus between dynastic rebellion and foreign invasion, allowing the boundaries of rebellion to become malleable in new and different ways. I like to illustrate this with the example of a law dating from 673. This law punished those who delayed assisting the king in situations involving either foreign invasion or local uprising against, quote, the fatherland and the nation people of the Goths, the king or his successors. The law prescribed penalties similar to the range of punishments applied to rebels, including enslavement with possible physical punishment, or exile, as well as property confiscation. This law, I insist, did not address open rebellion or joining the enemy. Rather, it punished lukewarm responses to this political and military crisis, a delay in immediately taking up arms against invasions or uprisings. By the early 7th century, the phrase kingdom or king fatherland, and nation people of the Goths, which probably originated in loyalty oaths, had helped to bridge internal rebellion and external invasion in legal discourse. Both actions threatened a polity defined in territorial, historical, and affective terms. This expanded the realm of possible rebellious actions and the arena of exceptional kingly authority to political behavior other than direct attempts at overthrowing the king. The third vignette I'd like to present relates to the discussion of political rebellion in terms of sin. The sources I will present are of a different nature. They emerge primarily from the acts of church councils, the records of assemblies of bishops and magnates of the kingdoms in the city of Toledo. These weren't regular meetings, but they were called by the king for specific purposes, and I will start with the 16th Council of Toledo, which met in 693. This council was convened by King Egica to deal with the recently discovery of a conspiracy to overthrow him. The conspirators included no less a figure than Sigismund, the bishop of the kingdom's capital. As was customary, the king sent a letter or thomus to the council to outline the topics for discussion. The king addressed the council attendants in an alarmed tone. The whole earth, he said, faced calamities because of God's wrath and the crimes of the faithless. In line with the growing penitential tone in Visigothic political discourse at the time, Egica argued that these calamities were a punishment the kingdom deserved because, as a Christian people, they had transgressed God's commandments. The king tasked the council with taking urgent measures, which included proclaiming the Orthodox faith, restoring abandoned churches, eradicating idolatry, reinforcing anti-Jewish legislation, condemning sodomy, and finally, imposing penalties upon those members of the court who plotted the death of the king or the, quote, destruction of the nation people and the fatherland of the Goths. The council complied. The bishops and grandees confirmed all the king's requests and even added further regulations to protect the descendants of a king after the king's death. They also ordered daily prayers for the king and his family in all the churches of the kingdom and ratified the sentence against Bishop Sigismund and all future clerics who committed similar crimes. The bishop's conspirator was excommunicated, deprived of his see and dignity, saw his property confiscated, and was sent into exile. The letter of Egica to the council placed rebellion within a range of behaviors perceived as sins by the church. These sins, or calamities, as the word they use, appear to have, in the eyes of the king, something in common. They subjected the kingdoms to the wrath of God, following Old Testament models, and threatened the salvation of its Christian people. Visigothic writers had inherited and developed a political theology from the late Roman Empire, according to which their ruler was appointed by God. While Christian authors acknowledged that the king could be unjust and oppressive, they fell short of legitimizing rebellion, even in those cases, on the understanding that rebellion broke a sacred oath. Visigothic sources repeatedly depict rebels as inspired by the devil. Thus, the connection between sin and rebellion was not a novelty at the time of the council. The act of this council, however, take a step further, very much in line with the expansion of penitential and eschatological ideas in the Visigothic political culture of the late 7th century. The liminal situation of rebellion between political crime and religious sin reminded the attendees of the council that what was at stake was not only the individual salvation of the sinner, but ultimately the spiritual welfare of the fatherland and the nation people of the Goths. By situating certain sins alongside rebellion, Egica and the Visigothic religious establishment were able to harden legislation in other areas. For instance, these council's canons and Egica's secular legislation introduced harsher penalties for sodomy. Mid-7th century laws punished same-sex male relationship with castration. To this penalty, Égica and the 16th Council of Toledo added excommunication, flogging, shameful head shaving, and perpetual exile. Similarly, Égica's anti-Jewish legislation toughened already harsh anti-Jewish laws. His earlier legislation prohibited Jews from having any commerce with Christians. Any transgression of this norm, as well as any religious relapses from Jews forcibly converted to Christianity, were punished with enslavement to the fisc. A year later, Égica went a step further and, together with the Council of Bishops, ordered a more stringent policy. The reason the acts of the Council explained were the following. Because of the populace of the Jews is known to be defiled with the vilest stain of sacrilege, stained with the blood of Christ, and notorious for frequently violated oaths, the more crimes they commit, the more necessary it is that they lament the severe loss in the punishment they had incurred, who, among their other crimes, had not only chosen to throw the order of the Church into confusion, but also attempted to ruin the fatherland and the whole people in a tyrannical conspiracy. There is no evidence that Jews, either as a collective or individual Jews, participated in any attempt to overthrow a king. Instead, bishops and king presented the Jews mere persistence in their beliefs, that is, their resistance against religious oppression and persecution, as an attempt to seize royal power, literally a tyranny. In addition to the king's letter to the council mentioned that Jews in the Visigothic kingdom had conspired with, quote, other Hebrews from overseas, unquote, to subvert the Christian faith. As a result, the council and the king ordered the enslavement of all Jews and so-called relapsed Jews. Just as the language of rebellion had evolved to include political dissidents, or a reluctance to take the king's side in a civil war, by the late 7th century, the language of dynastic rebellion framed religious, sexual, and other forms of nonconformist practices as the ultimate threat to the orderly society that the king was expected to protect. Thus, Visigothic political and religious establishment instrumentalized political rebellion, a threat only posed by Visigothic aristocrats, in the service of evolving forms of political domination over society as a whole. Let me conclude with a few observations. Rebellion was a much broader experience than what I had time to present today. My project tackles other questions as well, such as the relationship between property, law, and rebellion, the politics of violence and retribution, or how the Visigothic texts on rebellion came to define kingship and political community, to mention just a few. In this presentation, I only tackled the question of how political rebellion and the anxiety of ruling elites around attempts to overthrow the king were instrumentalized in the service of extending political domination or state power in multiple directions. The association between dynastical rebellion and what political elites considered non-conformist social behavior was not a given, but it became part of a political discussion around authority and its limits in post-imperial Hispania. We must not forget that for all the texts I presented today, every time the category of rebellion was extended to new actors, there were probably counter-discourses that challenged that expansion. Some of these challenges stemmed from historical actors with little power who left few direct testimonies in the sources, such as local communities or peasants who were repressed as tyrants in the 6th century, or Jews who were enslaved as tyrannical conspirators in the 7th century. Other challenges came from the very same groups that exerted political domination, including local oligarchies, bishops, and even royal officials. These groups succeeded in leaving their voices in the historical record, from where we can reconstruct, at least in part, this back and forth on the contours of rebellion. We must therefore not read these documents as the Visigothic idea of rebellion, but as part of a set of conflicts and tensions over these issues. This is my second takeaway point. These documents reveal that political domination in the aftermath of empire was a dynamic and never-ending process. Scholars have correctly indicated that the Visigothic kingdom became, as it were, consolidated, that's the most frequent expression, in the 6th century through claims of institutional centralization, Byzantine-like ceremonial, and a Christian political discourse. This process, I believe, is only half of the picture. It takes statehood for granted, statehood as a given, as a foundational moment that replicates itself over time. I hope, however, that my presentation has shown the fluctuating boundaries of the imagined political community, the discussions over exceptional power, the tensions over legitimate and illegitimate dissidents, and the struggles over royal authority. In other words, the discussion on rebellion echo anxieties over the always contingent character of political domination. Thank you very much. You need to sit here.
Yeah. Just. So, I think that Damián showed us very convincingly why the Visigothic kingdom deserves intensive study, not only as a crucial period in the history of Spain, but also more generally as part of what you've called a political anthropology. I think among the various post-Roman successor states in the West, the Visigothic kingdom can truly be characterized as a hothouse of political theory. And after having become annihilated by the Arab invasion of 711, its political heritage was recovered time and again by later polities on the Iberian Peninsula, while its texts were handed down through centuries, and thus also proved to be influential in the history of medieval France and Germany, for instance. In what follows, I shall make 5 points in which I will elaborate a little bit more on your talk and raise some further questions for our plenary discussion. I take as a starting point your observation that the notion of rebellion changed over time in the Visigothic kingdom. What was understood as rebellion could indeed be extended into different directions, referring to a tyrant as well to an external invader, while rebellion could embrace a religious connotation as a grave sin. This reminded me of a passage I came across from a law code from Frankish Gaul, another post-Roman successor state, in which, under the heading of infidelity towards the king, we find 3 crimes: treacherous action, parricide, and incest. I was always struck by this passage, while it seemed to be logical to me that such crimes were subject to penal law to some extent. I wondered how can I become disloyal to the king by killing my father or marrying my sister? What the hell has the person of the king to do with this? There might be, I believe, a historical and a systematic explanation to this, and both explanations could also be helpful to understand what was going on in Visigothic Spain. The systematic explanation is that the king was conceived of as embodying to some extent what we might call the public sphere, or what people thought of being as in public interest. The king had a role, so to speak, to protect what was regarded as belonging to the sphere of public law. This could differ very much, of course, but my impression is that the changing perception of rebellion could have somehow corresponded to a changing notion of the public sphere, of public interest and public law. And the protection of religious rules could become regarded as being part of this if a polity understood itself to be based on religious unity. But it was not the king alone. In particular, if you think that in Visigothic Spain the people swore loyalty to the king, the rex, the people, the gens, and the fatherland, the patria of the Goths, this went clearly beyond localizing the public in the person or in the role of the king alone. A historical aspect closely related to this is that we find many of the crimes associated with rebellion in Visigothic Spain similar to a very Roman notion of public law, that is the famous or infamous lèse majesté, the lesa majestas. For the Roman concept of high treason not only referred to attacks on the person and life of the emperor, but also included crimes like calling in a foreign enemy or inviting external troops into Roman territory or hosting them, thereby violating the territorial integrity of the Roman Empire. Moreover, the Roman idea of lèse majesty was a republican idea and had existed long before there ever was an emperor, meaning that it originally referred to the interest of the Roman people, the lesa majestas populi Romani. One could thus argue that the Visigothic notion of fidelity towards the Gothic king, the Gothic people and land was just an adaptation of the Roman concept of lèse majesty to the post-Roman polity of Visigothic Spain. This impression could be supported by the observation that in the late Roman period, also certain religious crimes, such as heresy, were conceived of as belonging into the category of lesa majestas. This is not to say that the Visigothic state simply continued late Roman ideas of statehood and its notion of a sphere of public law. Rather, it points to historical development, to an adaptation and adjustment of certain parts of it, which brings me to my second point, that is the use of the oath of fidelity in Visigothic Spain to safeguard public order and to protect what was considered as of public interest. The crucial role played by the Visigothic oath of fidelity seems to suggest to me that Visigothic infidelity was more or less an adaptation of certain aspects of Roman treason, which now in legal terms became essentially based on the oath every male subject had to swear. Thus, it appears as if Visigothic infidelity may have been a contractually founded lèse majesty based on the oath, but developed to more specific needs that depended on the political development and situation in 7th century Spain. At any rate, the oath you mentioned in your talk seems to have worked as some sort of vehicle for a legal transfer that allowed to transfer certain core ideas of Roman public law into Visigothic law. When looked at from a more functional perspective on order, this oath was a formal procedure that served to transform the military position of a successful usurper into legitimate rulership. And if Visigothic kingship was not dynastic but became elective, this rendered the oath even more important as a means of legitimization. The terms of this legitimacy are therefore extremely interesting. If loyalty was not owed to the king alone, but also to the gens et patria Gothorum, that is to the people and the fatherland of the Goths, it cannot have been the king alone who represented the Visigothic state. But who represented the gens and the patria Gothorum? I know one law from the Visigothic code where it is explicitly stated that the king was only allowed to pardon a traitor if this person had sought to attack him personally. If the treason was committed against the people and the land of the Goths, the king could not pardon the perpetrator alone, but had to consult the court officials and also the bishops of his kingdom. It thus seems as if the people and the land of the Goths were not represented by the king alone, but also involved further groups, among whom we should regard the bishops as of crucial importance. For instance, Jeremy Duquesne Adams, in an article, once interpreted the Visigothic councils, meetings which met in the presence of the king and were attended by bishops coming from all over Spain and from southern Gaul, as precursors of medieval and early modern parliaments. They had what he called prescriptive constitutional authority, a corporate continuity, representative composition, legislative competence, while they could also be consulted by the king on fiscal matters and gave their consent to royal succession. Such a comparison may push the case perhaps a bit too far, but I think the Fourth Council of Toledo, you quoted, when the bishops made deliberations on the precise function and meaning of the political oath to be sworn to in favor of the recent usurper Sisenand, could in some respects be called or understood as a representative assembly that sought to bestow legitimacy on a new ruler. At the same time, and this marks a definite contrast to late Roman treason, the bishops took control over the political oath, as they regarded it as a religious act that predominantly fell into their domain. Perjury was not only a political crime, but also a serious offense of God's majesty, and thus required personal penitence. I thus would like to ask, could it be that the oath was the great game changer in defining what could be regarded as a rebellious act? This brings me to a third point, that is punishments. You mentioned several punishments, such as confiscation of property, the death penalty, but also mutilation, cutting off a perpetrator's hand, and several strikingly defamatory punishments, such as a disgraceful parade through the streets of Toledo. This variety in punishments for rebellion seems to suggest that there were not, for all acts of rebellion, fixed, specific punishments, as does also seem to suggest the widespread practice of pardoning traitors. It seems to imply that punishment in cases of rebellion and treason was often arbitrary and to some extent negotiable. It is not the jus strictum that we find here, but rather a flexible handling of sanctions, and this may reflect the fact that legal prescriptions were oath-based, since by breaking your oath, you had in principle forfeited everything, including your life and property, and by self-obligation called down the most severe sanctions upon you. And so this left enough space for negotiation, I believe, of the terms that could be applied in terms of the character of the punishment that could be imposed. At the same time, as a rebel or tyrant had committed a grave religious misdeed by his perjury, something needed to be done about his damaged relationship to God. If rebellion was considered to be a serious sin, are we to conclude that it needed to be remedied by the bishops because it was a matter of their pastoral care for souls? It may fit if I insert my fourth point here that relates to ecclesiastical penance and to the disposition of a ruler. To my knowledge, the Visigothic kingdom is the first polity in world history to develop a legal procedure for lawfully deposing a ruler without needing to kill him. This is truly remarkable. Visigothic Spain had the highest number of rebellions, but it also had a high number of kings who were deposed and stayed alive, but did not return to power. This process of completely and permanently delegitimizing a monarch was largely achieved by the bishops, who could impose on a ruler, when he had lost support, the status of a penitentiary. The deposed king, after having been deprived of his office and tasked to rule, needed to do penance for the misdeeds he had committed while being in office. For the king, as a baptized Christian, was now regarded as a serious offender of God's commands, and thus as a grave sinner, which is why he needed to have the chance to repair his damaged relationship to God by doing penance for the rest of his life, which he could do in monastic exile, for instance. Thus, after having been stripped of his official position, the monks and clerics took care of his endangered soul. It is, to use a phrase famously coined by Ernst Kantorowicz, the medieval king's two bodies that we see here. A deposed penitential king had only his physical body left, and he needed the remaining time of his life to make amends for his soul and life after death. After all, we are dealing here with some sort of divine kingship. My final point concerns the perception of the Visigothic polity as a whole. I found the point particularly interesting that you linked your observations on rebellion and its perception as sin to the infamous Visigothic anti-Jewish policy. Since the early 7th century, Visigothic kings imposed forceful baptism on the Jewish population, to some extent supported by Visigothic bishops, while some of their colleagues remained skeptical about forceful conversion, as this would expectedly cause many Jews to return to their old faith, thereby committing, from a Christian perspective, apostasy, which aggravated things even more. If the Visigothic polity as a whole was conceived of as a Christian commonwealth to which all Goths belonged through their baptism and their oath of fidelity, and if the Christian Visigoths identified themselves as being the new people of God, the new Israel, as we find in several texts, what would this mean for religious outsiders, so to speak? My impression is that this led straight into a vicious circle, for the apostasy of forcefully converted Jews caused ever more severe sanctions, as we heard, inflaming God's wrath and thus endangering the individual welfare of the Gothic people. This was a situation where the devil could not be far away, and it tells us a lot about the inner divisions within Visigothic society, divisions that seem to be turned upside down if we look at the free and prominent position many Jews enjoyed following the Arab conquest of Spain. For them, a multi-religious commonwealth proved to be some kind of liberation. So this is from my side. I hope that this can instigate a bit of our plenary discussion on rebellion and its perceptions. And we would very much like to encourage also to, our Zoom audience to take part in this discussion. Thank you.
I want to answer some of your questions briefly, so we also give some time to the audience to ask questions. I think basically what you presented is, in large part, is what I was saying at the end, these counter-discourses, many of these counter-discourses that existed. And I think you're absolutely right on how all these, especially the evidence that comes from the Council of Bishops, is intended to offer an alternative model sometimes. I think there's also an important point that you raised that it was, I think it's interesting to mention here. The Roman background of many of these laws and many of these ideas, because 30, 40 years ago, these slight differences will be perceived as sort of Germanic law or sort of idea of Germanic law, and the language is clearly Roman in many ways. But yes, I think Stefan raised a very interesting point. So, to what extent the Council of Bishops, which is not just about bishops, they're also what the sources call the elders of the Goths, the Seniores Gothorum, or the palace officials meet and discuss certain issues. And I think there is, in these sources, in this discussion, there is a tension between expanding the arbitrary powers of the king, or the idea of the possibility of intervening in a more extreme way associated with rebellion, and the way an attempt of limiting that. I think there is one very interesting case that perhaps shows a different image, where the bishops tried to basically try to prevent the king from abiding to the law by creating an exceptional circumstances, and it's also associated with rebellion. This is the 8th Council of Toledo, the council where the king faces a problem to pardon rebels, because his father and predecessors forced the king, the current king, and the bishops in the kingdom to respect his decisions about the rebels. So he had condemned rebels to exile, so no one could pardon them. So basically that tied the hands of the king. And it's the Council of Bishops who says, actually, you can't do it. You can't go, you can't break an oath. You can't be an oath breaker because there's a higher principle here, it's the principle of pardoning or misericordia, right?
Yeah.
So I think that I see the discussion in the Visigothic councils between kings, bishops, and political elites in general as an arena where the boundaries between different types of power are moving constantly. And many times the bishops or the council issue laws that prevent this power to expand. But sometimes it's the other way around. It's not always clear, right? So they are very fascinating sources for that question. So thank you for raising all these issues. Let me see. The oath of fidelity as a vehicle of legal transfer of Roman law. So that's a very interesting point. Actually, the Visigothic law, there was a concept of what we can call public interest or public sphere, as you put it, and it's utilitas publica. So they adopted this Roman concept of utilitas publica in reference to taxation, military service, judicial service. So what a judge does is an utilitas publica, right? So I think there are two abstract ideas here coexisting at the same time, right? The common welfare, the commonwealth or the utilitas publica, and the notion of the kingdom, the fatherland of the gods. They coexist all throughout the history of the kingdom. What else? Yes. So the question of the penitential ideology is fundamental, and I think it's great that you raised it. There is a big break in the early 7th century, as you mentioned. Kings are not killed anymore when they are deposed. They are usually sent to a monastery, or they enter penitential state. There's one case, however, that is very interesting. This Chindasvend, who seemed to have entered penitential state while he was king. And so I think there is a broader discussion of what penitential state means in this context, but it's certainly part of the political language. I think, is there any other point that... Yes, and the anti-Jewish legislation, finally. This is also very interesting. And as you mentioned, this is perhaps the big question in Visigothic councils in the 7th century. But I don't think it enters the realm of rebellion until very late in the Visigothic kingdom, and that's where I noticed a change. It's happened towards the 7th century, the late 7th century, when the discourse of rebellion enters the question, which implies also the enslavement of Jews.
And when the Jews come under suspicion of being collaborating with the Arabs and things like that.
Or not. So they mention from overseas, so it's not clear. Perhaps I think it's a pure invention. They're not being suspicious of anything. It's just, it's important to remember that Julian of Toledo already in the story of Wamba associates rebellion with the perfidy of the Jews in southern Gaul. So it's there in the last quarter of the 7th century. But yeah, I mean, we can continue the concept, but I think yes, the two main points you raised are very important: the Roman inheritance of legal language, and the ways in which this attempt at expanding rebellions is checked by other members, at least members of the elite, as far as we can reconstruct it from the sources. But certainly there were probably other attempts.
Well.
Thanks so much for a fascinating talk. I have a question that's a bit naive because I don't know. I know about the use of accusations of treason in other settings, and so I'm just going more by that and asking this this rather basic question. I know in lots of places where accusations of rebellion are lodged, they're not based on the actual observation of rebellious behavior, but they're accusations.
Yes.
And in the course of making accusations like that, the usual practice that I'm familiar with elsewhere is for people to throw everything at the wall. So they might be drawing, in fact, on multiple strands of legal discourse about what constitutes rebellion. So, I did seem to notice in the examples that you gave, Damián, that there was a lot of overlap in the three strands of legal discourse that you discussed. And so this is really just a kind of a question about clarification, because I want to understand better what the value to you is of distinguishing between these strands of legal discourse when I'm imagining that in practice they're very often overlapping or used together or combined in ways that really show the fluidity of this legal discourse of rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. And so my interest is not so much on the accusations for rebellion itself, but how this concept is expanded to other areas. And but you're absolutely right. This there doesn't seem to be any distinction. It's just we don't have any specific case except for the rebellion of Paul, right? In the story of Wamba. We don't have any description of a trial, and even the description we have is highly stylized. So I'm not so much interested in the accusation of rebellions itself against the dynastic rebels, but how this is expanded to other areas and how this is used to instrumentalize. So this is my interest in the question. I cannot think of any source that for the Visigothic kingdom that specifically addresses that. Now there is a tension in the laws in general that they tend to accept accusations, especially for serious crimes, and expand the possibility of raising accusations of serious crimes. But also, they try to be careful about people bringing false accusations. So they facilitate the process of bringing accusations for treason and similar cases, but they're also very severe in the punishments for those who raise false accusations. So that's a concern that is present in the laws. But that's as much as I can tell you from the sources, from the extant sources. I cannot think of any specific instance other than that.
No. The interesting point is this connection between accusation and reward to the denouncers by receiving the confiscated property, which is some sort of encouragement to do that kind of thing.
Although it's not necessary, but the law doesn't prescribe that the accuser will receive the lands or the property. The property will be confiscated by the king, and the king will decide what to do with that property.
Well, and this is relevant to the point that you were making about the accusation itself inflicting a kind of punishment just because it throws the person being accused into this legal morass of a position of necessary defense that we know those things go on for a long time. In other places, I assume they can go on for a long time in this context too.
Yeah.
Is the oath of fidelity later what in later medieval times becomes doing homage to the king? Is that an early form or?
So this is a big historiographical debate. This practice was usually seen until the mid-20th century, when this idea began to be challenged, as the origin of what Visigothic historiography would call proto-feudalization, the origins of feudalism. As actually Stefan has demonstrated in an article, it has a Roman origin, and it's not related to this idea of homage in the medieval sense. But this was a very strong idea in Visigothic historiography in the early 20th century, especially because also the terminology is very similar.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a very particular question as to the punishment of disgraceful shaving. So I know that the Frankish realm, this was done for kings with the long hair, the sacred long hair. But I didn't know that the Visigoths had a similar kind of tradition, because if you punish somebody by shaving him, it means that he has to have a kind of special haircut that is taken away from him. So do we know more about the haircut of the Visigoths in that period? And if yes, who had that haircut? Just the princes, or there was a duke in your list who was disgraceful shaven?
Yeah. Thank you, Philip. So the crime is called, the practice is called the calvatio, and it's not clear what the term means. It could mean anything from scalping to just head shaving in a public and shameful fashion. We were talking about this the other day, and I think it's closer to public shameful head shaving. But the important thing to note is that this is a punishment for slaves. So that comes from a punishment applied to slaves. So it involves the loss of public and judicial reputation of the person. So it's a highly symbolic punishment.
Thank you so much for this talk. The Visigoths were very radical in their anti-Jewish legislation and action, and I would like to ask you to elaborate a little more about this point and to relate it to this fluid and undeveloped form of rule, apparently, that is going on here.
You mean the relation between theory and practice in anti-Jewish legislation?
Put in other words, is the anti-Jewish legislation and the confluence of loyalty, fidelity, and being a Christian, has this something to do with the actual instability and the fact that there is no such thing as a concept of statehood and kingship or monarchy in this area?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that anti-Jewish legislation is related to political discussions about the polity. That's absolutely right. I would say there were notions of polity and there were notions of kingship, but there were competing and coexisting notions. And I think anti-Jewish legislation plays in that dynamic too, especially when it comes to the notion of penitential state, the Christian, whether the communities, the kingdom is a Christian community or not, and this one. So in that sense, it does play a role. But I think it's one of the many different aspects in the discussion, precisely because there was no one single notion of what kingship and polity was. So I would say yes, in many cases it did play an important role. Yeah.
No, it is interesting because I think most part of the anti-Jewish legislation is actually directed against baptized Jews who returned to their old faith. Yeah. And so there was this forceful baptism in 615 under King Sigebut, which may be somehow related to the Persian conquest of Jerusalem the year before. It's not quite clear. But of course, this was done as a political measure to test loyalty and things. And we have, well, for the whole 7th century, time and again, we occur the problem that the Jews return to their old faith, and as they have been baptized, this is regarded as apostasy, and thus has to be punished in a Christian sense very severely. So this is also a vicious cycle. But it is not the only. The legislation is not only directed against baptized Jews, but there are also some measures which are more generally addressing Jews, like the one Damián has quoted.
Yeah. And sometimes they just mention Jews, right? They don't specify, so it's very ambiguous against whom this is directed.
But the very term baptized Jews is remarkable. Yeah. We find it in the sources. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question from one of your fellows, Ariella, who is currently not in Berlin. She thanks for a fascinating talk and asks, can you say more about the decision to avoid the use of the term usurpation?
Yes. So the problem with the term usurpation is that it's always seen from the perspective of the person who perceives himself as a legitimate king. So usurpation is in the eye of the beholder, and so naming a rebel an usurper implies a claim about legitimacy that I'm not comfortable with making. I think rebels may have had their own reasonings, and we can partially reconstruct some of the reasons why they rebelled, and they considered themselves legitimate rulers or potentially legitimate rulers. So that's why I want to avoid the term usurpation. Of course, the other concepts are not satisfactory either. Dynastic rebellion is not very satisfactory because there was no such a thing as a dynasty, the concept of a dynasty. And political rebellion is not satisfactory either because I think political rebellion implies more than just attempts at seizing the throne. So I'm still trying to find the right term to frame these actions. But that's the reason why I avoided the term usurpation.
Thanks, Damián, for the talk. If I understand your argument, I mean, one of the things you observe is that the dynastic rebellion was real. I mean, there was a lot of violence being directed against these Visigothic kings. At the same time, you seem to describe the articulation of these legal categories as a consolidation and extension of state power, which suggests that it wasn't simply just a response to the violence, but kind of going beyond just a response. And so I was just wondering if once these things were legislated, were they efficacious? I mean, do you actually see any kind of decrease in the violence that's actually being directed against these Visigothic kings? And so are there other evidences of the efficacy of this extension of state power?
Thank you. That's a great question. And so in part I already answered, and Stefan already mentioned the decreasing violence about killing the king, the ruling king, right? So that's a change. 7th century reigns tend to be slightly longer than 6th century reigns, so there is that. But dynastic rebellion never ended. Actually, you can even say that the fall of the kingdom of the Visigoths was provoked by a rebellion. So by the time the Arab-Berber armies entered the Iberian Peninsula, there was a rebellion, possibly a civil war, and the king himself, the king that was ruling in southern Spain at the time of the Arab-Berber conquest, he himself had been probably a rebel. So the problem was on them. So it didn't solve that problem, but the problem is that we tend to see this as a sign of state weakness, whereas I see it mostly as a sign of institutional or monarchical weakness rather than state or political domination in the broader sense. I think the state or the kingdom was a highly centralized kingdom by the early 8th century, and that's why the conquest was so easy. Because and so my answer, I guess, is yes and no. Sorry.
Damián, thanks. Can you say something about territory in your story across that period? So with that centralization endpoint. So on the one hand, you talked about anyone who could go abroad, but actually the blurring of the boundaries between the abroad and the internal rebellion. But also, what is the territorial imagination, if there was one, around the fatherland? Whose lands were these? How did property fit into it? Do you take the king's lands? What are you doing here? If you're,
yeah, that's a great and a very difficult question to answer. I think Mateus is here. He wrote a very interesting article about maps in history about in relation to the war of Ukraine. But I think this applies to the Visigothic kingdom too. So if I show you maps, you see the Visigothic kingdom is more or less stable, for instance, the early 6th century into the 8th century. What that means, what territorial control means in the early 6th century and the late 7th century is something completely different. So about the boundaries of frontiers, the main concern about Visigothic elites, especially in the 7th century, tended to be the frontier between the kingdom of the Visigoth and the Frankish kingdoms, because there were several of them. Because there were also Gothic families on the other side of the frontier. So for many families, for many groups, there was no real boundary. There were Goths on both sides of the frontier. So this could be a notion of territorialization that is also fluctuating over time. So it's not stable. It's difficult to answer. I don't know any particular work on this concept. There's a work. There's an article by Margarita Vallejo Girvez is coming out on frontiers, but it's not something that has been worked in greater detail. But I do think there is a changing relationship between territory and kingship, territory and monarchy from the early 6th century into the 8th century, and that these borders were never a fixed idea in the sense of the modern territorial states. I don't know if this is...
Thank you. I would like to ask a question about the councils of bishops. It seems that it takes a really important role in the discussion, in the articulation of the laws and the limitation or expansion of the king's power. What is the authority of this body? It seems that cannot be understood in terms of earthly power versus spiritual power, or something of this sort. You mentioned the elderly, so it seems that there is an element of the representing the people, something like this. What gives this body an authority? What limits its authority? How separate it is from the king? Can the king dominate the council, replace it when it doesn't fit his interests, etc., etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Ari. This is a great question, and this is a crucial question for Visigothic history, especially in the 7th century. There are long periods where councils are not called by the king, so it's up to the king to call a council, and in most cases happened at the moment of succession. So it is related to the question of legitimacy. Now, about the efficacy of the decisions, I think we have inherited a historiography in the Visigothic kingdom that sees the law either as completely useless, that has no impact in reality. So the state is sort of an empty shell, and the day-to-day life is ruled by what the historiography call local powers, or that the law represents what actually was applied in local courts in the process of this judicial adjudication, both in ecclesiastical and secular spheres. I think both secular law and church councils were the beginning of the discussion. So you have these enactments coming from the court, and then they will reach local communities. Bishops will bring the acts of the council to the local communities, and then the discussion will begin. And then, and you see that there's a back and forth on several issues throughout the history of the kingdom. That seems, well, the question of the converted Jews, right? It's something that is never solved.
Yeah.
The bishops go with these councils, and some of them perhaps never apply this legislation. So I think that these laws represent the beginning of a discussion that will eventually be decided at the local level. The relation between secular and religious law, there's a lot of contamination, if you want, back and forth. There's one interesting case actually related to rebellion. The 16th Council of Toledo, the council that I mentioned about this bishop who rebelled, and then the king writes this letter relating sin, relating rebellion to sin and other other sins. The bishop approaches the king approaches the council with the language of sin, right? He sends this letter typifying rebellion as a sin and saying this is very similar to this other sin. The bishops reply with the language of the law. They go back to the canonical legislation, to the Fourth Council of Toledo, and said this is what's going to be applied in this case. So these councils were, the acts of the councils, this conciliar legislation occasionally has an impact even in discussions over rebellion. Is this what you ask? I'm not sure. Yeah, answer you.
Sorry. Thank you very much for that. Just a question on that first chronic you showed in the first section, which had that injunction of the servant not rebelling against the master, where they were using the very specific terms of the famulus and dominus. Am I right in thinking that's supposed to have a connotation of sort of private household law? And when you were talking about sort of competing notions of kingship, does that mean that that notion of the kingdom as sort of the household responsibility of the king is still to some degree in play?
Thank you, Christian. Yes. So I think this is actually one notion of kingship that I think by the time John of Viclary is writing his chronicle, this is a very old-fashioned view that belongs to an earlier generation, the generation that resulted from Leovigil's earlier conquest of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's why I think he's using these concepts, because even in his chronicle you have, for instance, he mentions the word patria, right? There's other ideas circulating at the time, and 20 years later you have the Fourth Council of Toledo. But so I think that perhaps I'm not sure where that comes from, to be honest. Perhaps may have some Roman precedents, but it's old-fashioned by the time John of Viclary is already writing that. But certainly it was. I think my impression is that it was one of the notions of kingship, especially in the mid-6th century.
Thank you.
That was very clever. So I'm in a difficult position here. I'd like to ask one last question and then invite you over to dinner. So I'll start with a question. It's quite an interesting question. It's the after-death question. On a topic of shameful shaving, you mentioned the ruler also losing his right hand. Do we know of any concept similar to the damnatio memoria for Roman emperors? Given that the king lost both his hair and hand, he seems to have lost his legitimation during life. Are there any concepts to erase bad kings from history after their death? And after that answer, you will get the closing remarks.
I don't know of any damnatio memoria. Well, actually, Arjun, the person whose hand is cut, he never managed to become king. But I don't know of any case of damnatio memoria in the. If anything, actually, the sources mention these rebels, right? To advertise the punishment.
I do not know any either, but what is really interesting, what Damián said in his talk, that we have some coins of kings which are not attested in our written sources. Yeah. And so...
Yeah, maybe. So Sunifred, who is attested in the coin,
so there must have been more kings than we know.
Yeah.
On that note, thank you so much for a fascinating talk, for an interesting conversation. Thank you for all your questions. Tomorrow, you are cordially invited to join us on Zoom for a lecture by Ariela Aisha Azoulay entitled Algeria, the Jews are still present in every bracelet. It will be held in Dresden, so you either travel or join by Zoom. And on Thursday, George Packer will discuss his latest book, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal. And now you get the after-lecture invitation to a dinner with a beautiful sunset. Thank you so much.